with these substances is still evolving then. But back then,
we hope it's evolving.
We hope so.
Yeah, we hope.
But here's an interesting quirk that's kind of personal. That law said that existing stockpiles, for example, of heroin, when it was made illegal, well, existing stockpiles that are in hospitals may continue to be used up. So when my father was in his residency in the early 1950s in western Pennsylvania, well, a few times he actually had to deliver a baby, and he had an option of morphine, but this hospital still had a supply of heroin. So he ordered the heroin. Wait, whoa. You gave heroin to a pregnant woman who's delivering her baby? No, you didn't do that. And he said, what are you talking about, John? I chose it because the analgesia is just as effective, if not more, than morphine, and it's going to hit the brain faster. That which makes it more, so addictive. But in this case, getting the pain relief a little bit faster was very compassionate to do for the pregnant mother. And it's not like she became a heroin addict again. She wasn't in pain. The procedure was over, and it was fine. It was no different than if I had chosen morphine, except probably a little bit better. And, that's just astonishing because, by today's consciousness, we only think of heroin as this painful drug of abuse, right? And it's this too powerful opiate. Well, right now, fentanyl is sadly available and killing people because it's 100-fold more potent than heroin. But that came because it's a medicine that's very important, especially as part of modern day surgery. So
people have no idea how many
abused.
Many people have taken fentanyl without knowing it. Again, you might know better, John, but I mean, it's basic part of most anesthesia combos. I think you'd be shocked at how many people
have it.
We have it, right?
Yeah. It's even though it's killing lives, it has saved so many lives because if you're needing surgery, right? Even if we knock you out, your body is still feeling pain, and your heart rate's going to go up, and you could have a heart attack on the table. So you give a potent opiate, even though you're knocked unconscious. So we have to deal with analgesia, the pain side. That's what the fentanyl's for. You give an amnestic, like a benzodiazepine, because it makes it harder just in case the person is sort of remembering the surgery. Now they won't. And we, of course, give them something to knock them out that they're unconscious. So it's those three different domains that need attendance for successful anesthesia for a procedure. And that's why fentanyl is picked commonly. And if the idea of getting rid of it will destroy modern surgery.
Well, I have to give credit to the 1950s. We always think of it as this buttoned-down culture, but heroin in the maternity ward, it's like less Leave It to Beaver and more Studio 54. Well, thank you for describing that because I think that describes well the difference before the war on drugs is declared in the Nixon administration. So what changes with the war on drugs from the mid-20th century when it could occasionally be prescribed or it's not criminalized? So what happens with the war on drugs and opium?
Well, a lot. I mean, I think that it was used all along, and you have to understand that going back a little bit, opium enforcement really came to the fore when Prohibition ended because all those agents needed to keep their jobs. In particular, a guy named Harry Anslinger who needed to keep his job. With the Federal Bureau, he created the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which is now the DEA. So what made Nixon, John, I mean, part of it was Vietnam, people coming back addicted. Part of it was hippies, I mean, I think it was Haldeman. One of them said it was really all about the hippies. I think it was a little more focused on marijuana.
But also remember, it was woven through with race and music, just like with marijuana, the naming of Anslinger, the persecution of Billie Holiday. There were a number of famous jazz musicians who were heroin dependent, very publicly so, and some of them had overdoses. So it became known in the 1950s then as something of danger and associated with helping those with race-based discriminatory policies as another angle on justification for these types of discriminatory laws. And it came to more of a critical head, without a doubt, in the 1960s.
Today, now bridging that between that and then in the last few years when it seems opioid addiction and death has absolutely exploded, what triggered the current crisis that wasn't there in the last few decades?
Well, something happened that is very familiar when you read our book. The history will repeat itself, if not well known. And so we've gone through phases of undertreating pain and then, quote-unquote, over-treating pain. And so if you undertreat pain, there's morbidity and mortality with that. As I mentioned, not just, on the operating table, but people, when they're suffering in too much pain, their lifespan decreases. People with chronic pain, there's actually brain change over time. There's shrinking of gray matter in your brain when you're chronically in pain, severe pain over years. So we should be treating that. We know how to alleviate suffering. Okay, so we get aggressive at treating the pain with medications that can be abused without the right type of oversight or attention to the patient chronically using it, because that might be too expensive then for our health system. And now we have cavalcades of people who wind up getting addicted to illegally sourced medications because they get cut off from what was given to them by physicians initially to treat things post-surgically or from other injuries, etc. So we became, as a culture, much more aggressive again, trying to respect people in need of pain to provide good medical care. And that whole process was done without, at the same time, upgrading our measures to canvass for and prevent people becoming opiate dependent beyond treating their pain.
And I'll tell you one thing as background to that people, I think most people don't know. The guy that invented morphine, the two guys that it seems that invented the hypodermic needle, and I think three people at who invented heroin, all thought they were coming up with a way to deliver opium in a way that was less addictive. And actually, though we won't defend Purdue Pharmaceuticals for their marketing tactics, the fact is there were a bunch of guys and women in labs trying to find a less addictive way to deliver the key part of the opiates, and they came up with OxyContin, which turned out to be one of the most deadly drugs in history. Again, John might want to add some scientific detail to that.
Well, even the damage was done with that drug very much in its marketing of it. It was even put forward that there would be less addiction because it was so potent and so effective that they wouldn't need to be prescribed in as much quantity as other opiates, rather than appreciating the fact that that may make it even a stronger calling card. And indeed, people paying as much as $1 a milligram. So 50 milligram pill, single pill, $50. And then suddenly just figuring out that drug laws are different in different states, and these pill mills, especially developed in Florida, we have vast quantities leaving the state, distributing across from Florida to elsewhere. There's a major problem with it. But that drug, when at some of the biggest screaming in the public space about how people are dying now from OxyContin, the manufacturer changed the formulation to something that if you try to grind it up to snort it, it actually turns to a type of kind of like goo, and you won't be able to snort it anymore. But I believe, in the era of YouTube experimentation, there's some sort of method with microwaving the crushed pill and everything else that allows it to disgustingly be snorted again. But there was this, World War II and earlier, Cuban cigars were always legal, even in the Cuban boycott in the United States. It seemed that there was a curated desire to find these pre-reformulation pills of OxyContin for a time as well, with people paying a premium for that. But damage done. And it's not like the manufacturer of OxyContin was able to regain market share because now they have this new formulation that won't be as easily snortable. It became correctly known as a drug that's driving tremendous waves of addiction, with another generation of people getting fed up with trying to buy pills on the street and then finding it, quote unquote, easier to just start using heroin. Huh. And that's why we're looking at about 1 million Americans with a heroin problem these days. When I was in medical school, the number was around 500,000 chronic users. So we've doubled it. And
we also
just astonishing.
And also, John, I mean, the issue that I exaggerate, but anyone in their own little home lab can make an incredibly deadly opioid now has upped the ante even more.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. Well, something that you two include in the book is, a combination of strategies, including controversial ones, to reduce addiction and overdose. I'd like to hear those, but with the theme in mind of history being a laboratory of human experience that I always like to, push on this podcast, that we've seen empires and kingdoms and states deal with opium in very different ways across history, from giving it to soldiers as a part of their whole combat protocol that they use before they enter into battle, end-of-life treatment, all the way to criminalization today. So there's a whole spectrum. So what solutions do you two propose, and are there examples in history you've seen as positive and negative examples that informed how you came up with your solutions?
Well, there are a variety of strategies today that have been employed that up to now the United States we've been very hesitant to consider. I mean, Portugal more than 20 years ago decriminalized all drugs for personal use, as did then the Netherlands, as has Switzerland, as has Italy, and those countries have not imploded. But
overdose rates in Portugal are 2% of those in America, the rates of overdose.
Wow.
Yeah,
2%.
Yet we will say that, well, these are more homogeneous cultures that can have this type of debate, and the country is much smaller. But much of it is to just run away from placing life ahead of what is asserted as part of our moral compass. But I would say reducing death and the damages from addiction should take precedence over the way in which we get there, because life is precious. And that's the ultimate teaching point to our children. So we can't tell people don't do this, right? We have these laws, but in the end, the best we can do is to teach our children right from wrong and hope for the best. Everybody has to face their own choices of their life, and it's a shame that very little progress in some ways has been made in the United States, and I think it's because, in part, we're just constantly putting our heads in the sand, trying to avoid the lessons of contemporary countries that are in a different place with this, but also the lessons from the past of what doesn't work. We keep revisiting draconian punishments, hoping that will get us out of this problem, and it hasn't, and it never will. So it's from that perspective we cast a wide net looking at what may help change